All right, here we go with section 4. Here's the focus question. From 1964 to 1972, black insurgencies occurred in every major urban center in the country. These often began as confrontations between police and black residents, escalating into battles involving the looting and burning of white owned businesses. The violence was fueled by the anger of young urban blacks who grew up in segregated neighborhoods rife with unemployment, decaying housing, and police surveillance. The first outbreaks of violent battles between blacks and mostly white police erupted in Harlem in 1964. The larger uprisings of 1965 in Watts, a black enclave in Los Angeles, saw 50,000 protesters attack police and firemen, loot white owned businesses, and burn buildings. After the National Guard restored order, 35 had been killed, mostly by the police, 900 injured, and 20 million in property destroyed. By the summer of 1967, urban rebellion seemed everywhere. Some feared racial war. Urban uprisings left 23 dead in Newark and 43 dead in Detroit, huge parts of which were devastated. Johnson appointed a commission headed by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner to study the causes of urban disorder. The Kerner report blamed the uprisings on segregation and poverty, including white racism, and arguing for a massive influx of federal investment into black communities. Despite the report's well-publicized findings, few of its recommendations were followed as the Johnson administration became increasingly preoccupied with the Vietnam War. The legislative successes of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 largely did not address the poverty and economic degradation in black urban communities. Consequently, civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. shifted their focus toward economic goals. In 1964, King called for a Bill of Rights that would offer positive economic rights to African Americans, what would later become known as affirmative action. In 1966, King launched the Chicago Freedom Movement, which demanded an end to discrimination by employers and unions, equal access to mortgages, the integration of public housing, and decentralized low-income housing. However, the civil rights tactics that were effective in the South, such as sit-ins and marches, were no match for the political machine of Chicago's Richard J. Daley and white homeowners who fiercely opposed King. As a result of the movement's failure, King became more radical and started to call for a better distribution of wealth for all God's children. If the early civil rights movement had clear objectives and profound accomplishments, the later movement saw political fragmentation and few victories. Even at the height of integration struggles, the incendiary orator Malcolm X insisted that blacks must control the political and economic resources of their own communities and avoid working with whites. Born Malcolm Little, he committed several crimes as a youth. Malcolm X converted in jail to the Nation of Islam, or black Muslims, who preached a message of white evil and black discipline. Malcolm dropped his slave surname in favor of X, symbolizing black separation from African ancestry. Released from prison, Malcolm X became a spokesman for the black Muslims and a vehement critic of the integrationism and nonviolence of King and the civil rights movement. Unlike King, Malcolm X saw nothing redemptive in American values. On a 1964 trip to Mecca, Islam's spiritual center, Malcolm X saw interracial harmony among Muslims and moderated his message, embracing the possibility of interracial cooperation for radical change in America. But his assassination in early 1965 left no consistent ideology or organization behind. His calls for black independence inspired the urban poor and younger civil rights activists, and his 1966 autobiography became a bestseller. Malcolm X was the father of Black Power, a slogan popularized by SNCC's leader Stokely Carmichael in 1966 during a march in Mississippi. Black Power rallied those who were angry with the federal government's failure to stop violence against civil rights activists, white attempts to dominate the movement, and the movement's inability to influence the economic plight of urban blacks. Black Power suggested everything from electing more blacks to political office to the belief that blacks were a colonized people whose freedom could only be won through revolutionary struggles for self-determination. The idea reflected the radicalization of young civil rights activists and inspired cultural pride. The word Negro was abandoned for Afro-American, and African dress and hairstyles were celebrated. Previously interracial civil rights groups like SNCC and CORE also repudiated their inclusion of whites, and they soon disintegrated. New groups sprang up, however, most prominently the Black Panther Party, formed in Oakland, California in 1966 to protest police brutality. The Black Panthers won notoriety for advocating armed self-defense, and their militant stance and actions alarmed moderate blacks and many whites. Troubled by internal disputes and police and FBI repression, the Black Panthers had disintegrated by the early 1970s. So that's the end of section 4. We'll be back for section 5.